Who do you say I am? Jesus' searching question to his first disciples is his searching question to us today. Never mind what other people say. What about you? Who do you say I am? Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Readers of Mark's Gospel have known that from the opening words, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. Peter was right, but he had no idea what it meant for Jesus or for himself. So Jesus had to teach his disciples what it meant. In particular, he had to teach them about the necessity of the cross. 3 times in 3 chapters, Mark records that Jesus predicted his death. And each time he drew out the implications for his followers. A call to self-denial, suffering, and humble service. A message as countercultural today as it was then. Well, let's consider the first prediction in Mark chapter 8. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. The Son of Man was Jesus' favourite way of referring to himself. It was not a common messianic term, which made it somewhat obscure and allowed Jesus to fill the title with the content of his own words and works. The expression, the Son of Man, actually goes back to the Old Testament, and particularly to Daniel chapter 7, a vision in which Daniel saw God, the Ancient of Days, give everlasting, worldwide dominion to one like a Son of Man. In my vision at night I looked, Daniel writes, and there before me was one like a Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Jesus was identifying himself with the figure in Daniel's vision when he called himself the Son of Man. And this Son of Man, the one to whom God has given universal, everlasting, indestructible dominion, is the one who must suffer many things and must be killed. What? Is it any wonder that Peter found the idea of Jesus' suffering and death unacceptable? Jesus spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Peter was no doubt looking for a conquering, victorious Messiah. This talk of suffering and death just wouldn't do. We can't help but be struck by the audacity of Peter's rebuke of Jesus and by the fierceness of Jesus' rebuke of Peter. "Get behind me, Satan." In God's plan to redeem his people and restore his creation, there could be no easy victory, no shortcut to success. The path marked out for Jesus was suffering, then glory. To propose anything else came not from God, but from Satan. The cross was not arbitrary. It was necessary. Jesus had to die. The last verse of our passages from Mark in chapter 10 reads, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." No ransom, no redemption. Without his death for us, there could be no life for us, only the prospect of death and judgment. If he did not take our place on the cross, we would have no place with him in God's kingdom. From the necessity of the cross in his own life and ministry, Jesus turns to the implications for the life of his disciples. Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." Do you hear the language of necessity? Just as the Son of Man must suffer many things and must be killed, so anyone who wants to be his disciple must deny themselves, to take up their cross and follow him. Jesus did not come to empower your selfish ambitions, to enshrine your misplaced sense of security, to endorse your misdirected craving for status, or to enable your lifestyle aspirations. He came to turn your life around, to turn it upside down and inside out. If you want to be his disciple, you must deny yourself and take up your cross and follow him. Suffering, then glory, was the path marked out for Jesus, and everyone who wants to be his disciple must follow him on that same path. Suffering, then glory. We must not gloss over or sanitize the imagery of taking up our cross. It's a very familiar phrase, isn't it? What does it mean? It is an image of public persecution, cruel torture, and a shameful slave's death. For Jesus' first century listeners, for the disciples hearing this challenge, for the crowds hearing that this is what it would mean to follow Jesus, the image that came to mind was not putting up with bad coffee, as much as I dislike that, or dealing with a lazy husband or a nagging wife, or dying of embarrassment for standing out in the crowd because you're a Christian. No, the language of taking up your cross pictures a condemned man shouldering the crossbar of his own crucifixion and staggering through mocking crowds on his way to the place of execution, as Jesus did, until he couldn't carry it anymore because they had beaten him so badly that they had to get someone else to carry the crossbar for him. To be clear, Jesus doesn't teach an unhealthy desire for martyrdom. This isn't the suicide bomber's approach to discipleship. What he does teach is a willingness to suffer for his sake, for him and for the gospel. Similarly, self-denial does not mean self-loathing or self-neglect, but self-forgetfulness as we focus on Jesus and on others, not ourselves. God made and cares for you, so do look after yourself, but don't live for yourself. Following Jesus means learning to pray as he did. Not my will, but yours be done. Against the backdrop of a Western culture of expressive individualism, whose constant refrains are, express yourself, be true to yourself, seek your own fulfillment, define your own destiny. Don't let anything stand in the way of your personal pleasure. Jesus' demand fits in like a hand grenade in a children's toy box. Jesus first or me first? That is the stark choice, and one we face many times over. Jesus first or me first? One answer will save your life. The other answer may gain you the whole world, but it will cost you your soul. Jesus first or me first? What is your answer? Let's turn to chapter 9 and the second prediction. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and 3 days later he will rise." But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. In a focused time of teaching his disciples, Jesus predicted his death a second time, but they still didn't understand and were afraid even to ask him what he meant. Do you understand the necessity of Jesus' death for you? Are you depending on his death for your sins, or are you placing your ultimate trust in someone or something else? If you are trusting in your own righteousness to stand you in good stead before God's judgment seat, well, there are mirrors available for self-examination in all of our bathrooms. Have you understood the necessity of Jesus' death for you? For a second time, Jesus' prediction of his death is followed by an implication for his disciples. They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they kept quiet, because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all." He took a little child whom he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me." Here is a paradox of God's upside-down kingdom. If you want to be first, you must be the very last and the servant of all. Someone who assumes a low, dependent status, like that of a little child. Now we see that the call to Christian humility is not only a call to humility before Jesus, but a call to humility before others as well. Martin Luther famously wrote in his treatise on the freedom of the Christian, "A Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none." That is our confidence because God has justified us through faith in Jesus. But on the flip side, here's the paradox. A Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all. Well, finally, we turn to chapter 10. They were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We are going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later he will rise." Jesus led the way towards Jerusalem, to the astonishment of his disciples and the fear of the following crowd. Again, a third time, Jesus took his disciples aside and predicted his death in the most graphic language yet. He knew what was coming. But for their sake, and for your sake and mine, he walked headlong into it, leading the way. Now listen to the very next thing we read. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." "You don't know what you are asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared." 5 chapters later, of course, Jesus would be crowned with thorns and hailed as King of the Jews as he was executed on a Roman cross. And those at his right and at his left would be hanging, not sitting, 2 criminals crucified with him. In one sense, only Jesus could drink the cup of suffering, the cup of God's wrath, and be baptized or immersed in the suffering of God's judgment. And he drank it so we would never have to drink it. He was plunged into judgment in our place instead of us. In the New Testament, though, there is another sense in which through our identification with Jesus, we are called to share in his sufferings. How crass it sounds then, just after Jesus has graphically described the horrors he is about to endure, that James and John come bounding up saying, "Me first, me first. Give us whatever we want. Give us the best seats in glory." It's as though the more often and the more clearly Jesus predicts his death, the more oblivious and self-centred his disciples become. How are you responding to the death of Jesus? Has it become so familiar that you have become oblivious to it, or started to treat it merely as a springboard for your own self-centred requests? If you have, let me encourage you, use this Easter season to feel it afresh. The necessity of the cross, the unspeakable horror and indescribable love of it, and its searching demand. Deny yourself. Take up your cross and follow me. Notice that the problem in Mark 10 wasn't just the request of James and John. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John, presumably because James and John got in first. Remember, they'd all been arguing on the road about who among them was the greatest. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers among the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Christians, the cross is both the means of our salvation and the model for our life and ministry. Do you see? Because we trust in a crucified Saviour, our lives must be cross-shaped. Those who follow a servant Lord must themselves be servants. That is especially true of Christian leaders. There is no place in Christian leadership for puffed up prima donnas on platforms. I heard about one church where all the new leaders were rostered on to clean the toilets for their first year serving as leaders in the church, so that they might learn. Whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. In chapter 8, we saw Peter rebuked for speaking the words of Satan when he tried to dissuade Jesus from the path of suffering and death. Later, Peter would understand, and he would write these words: "Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps."